Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week we are focused on education and the 2023 legislative session. Full funding for MAEP is on the table, but will the Senate's bill meet House approval? We'll talk with Nancy Loome of the Parents Campaign about her group's push for full funding and their pressure on House leaders to take up the bill. We'll also update the status of some other key legislation in these final weeks of the session. It's all ahead on this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. Joining me now in the studio to talk about education funding and more is Nancy Loome. She is the executive director of the Mississippi Parents Campaign, that nonprofit grassroots network of parents and other Mississippians supporting public education in our state. Nancy Loome, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you.
You've been very vocal in support of House Bill 1369 as it was amended by the Senate. Explain to viewers why you support the full funding of this legislation.
Well, full funding is so important to our public schools, and let me give you a little bit of the backstory on that. You know, there is nothing that is more important to the viability of our state than our public schools. It's where the majority of our children are educated. It's where our workforce is developed. Those are the lifeblood of our communities. And there is so much to celebrate in public education in Mississippi. I think too few people really understand the success story that we have in Mississippi public schools. You know, 20 years ago, we were ranked 50th in the nation in student achievement. And we were improving over all those years. But what we have seen is that when we have significant investments in public education, that progress really accelerates. And so today, not only are we not 50th, we have sailed past 29 other states. We are now ranked 21st in the nation in fourth grade reading and 32nd in fourth grade math. So I say that to say that teachers and students have demonstrated time and again that when we invest in them, they deliver.
So what have we done right to jump from 50th to those numbers where we are today?
As I said, significant investments, and particularly in things that improve fourth grade reading scores. So we've seen some escalation in state funding in the early years, but then more recently, we saw very targeted funding for literacy coaches and literacy programs in fourth grade reading. And so we saw those fourth grade reading scores really escalate. But you know, parents and employers will tell you that there is more to a well-rounded education than just fourth grade reading and math. And that is the beauty of MAEP funding, Mississippi Adequate Education Program funding, which you mentioned earlier. And that is the formula that's in law that tells legislators how much money, state money, each school district should get to provide a well-rounded, high-quality education for students. Unfortunately, over the years, the state has not come through with the amount of funding that the formula says it should provide our schools. And so that is the exciting thing about this Senate plan, is that it injects an additional $181 million statewide into our public schools. And that is very flexible funding. So I mentioned that targeted funding that helped our fourth grade literacy scores improve. But there's so much else. You know, there's career and technical education. There are all these other subjects, advanced courses, help for struggling students. MAEP funding can be used in the ways that local school districts need to use it to make sure that their children and their own communities are excelling. So it's not this siloed, targeted funding that a school district may or may not really need. It's very flexible funding for whatever are the needs of the children in the local district.
So you're okay with the formula that the Senate wants to do as far as the funding formula that the Senate is putting out?
So the Senate has proposed some tweaks to the MAEP formula. Most importantly, they did not change the objective formula for the base student cost. That is the primary driver of the funding formula. You might remember a few years ago, there was a proposal to change the funding formula. We referred to that as the Ed Build. And what that proposal did was to completely remove the objective formula for the base student cost. It would have allowed the legislature to just pick whatever number it wanted to come up with as full funding of public schools, and you can imagine why that would be problematic. So the Senate plan leaves that intact. It does nothing to change that piece of the MAEP. What it tweaks, it makes some little tweaks to the inflationary component that is, there's a recalculation of the formula every 4 years. And in the 3 intervening years, they use this inflationary component to determine how much the funding will be increased every year. And so there were some tweaks to that. It was the changes were fairly minor.
What confidence did you have that they will continue to fund beyond this year? Because they've made these promises before, but then they pull back and don't fully fund. So why would you be confident that they wouldn't do the same thing?
Well, that's one of the reasons that we supported some minor tweaks to the formula, because the concern that we've heard from lawmakers is that they worry that the formula will grow too fast, or the amount that it generates will grow too fast, and that they will be unable to fund it, that they'll be able to keep up with that. And so that the little tweak to the inflationary component will ensure that we would still see an increase in funding each year, but it wouldn't escalate quite as fast. And so if the formula is fully funded this year, and then for in subsequent years it only grows maybe $10 million, $15 million, $20 million. That's something that's very doable in the eyes of legislators. It doesn't seem like a difficult hill to climb to get there. And I do have confidence that they would do that. Legislators want to fully fund our schools. They realize how important that is. They have said for years that we didn't have enough money. We know that this year, the really good news is that we have well more than enough money. There's an extra $1 billion. The Legislative Budget Office has told us that is above and beyond everything that was budgeted in the last legislative session. And that is 4 times what is needed, more than 4 times what is needed to fully fund schools.
The complaint from some is being given that this money will go more toward administrative expenses and not going towards to teachers themselves. What do you think of that argument, that it's not going to go where it needs to really go to?
That is a distraction. That is simply false. One of the things that we took a look at was the comparison of what each school district received in state funding, state MAEP funding, and what each school district spent on only teacher salaries and benefits. No principals, no central office staff, no secretaries, just instructional teacher salaries and benefits. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that statewide, school districts spent more on only teacher salaries and benefits than the entire MAEP appropriation. So the idea that they are spending those dollars on administrators is simply false.
Governor Tate Reeves was vocal in his skepticism about altering the MAEP formula, saying, quote, be very cautious of a last-minute change of funding formula that seems to have a unanimous support amongst Democrats in the Senate and liberal activist groups. Very, very cautious. Then his office added, instead of funneling more money to the district offices where our kids won't see it, why not another teacher pay raise? Put it in the classroom. What do you say to what the governor had to say?
Well, there was unanimous support in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So not just among Democrats. Every single senator where there's a Republican supermajority voted for that bill. So it is widely supported. You may have seen that there was a Siena poll that came out earlier this week, where 79% of Mississippians who were polled want to see the MAEP fully funded. So there is broad support for this. In terms of a pay raise, so the legislature passed a very significant pay raise last year. It was badly needed. We have a real teacher shortage, and we need to continue to improve teacher salaries. But a problem with only putting the money in teacher salaries is because schools have been so dreadfully underfunded, and because local communities realize how important that funding is to schools, in the communities that have a strong local tax base, the communities that could, they raise their local taxes to be able to make up the difference. And so they hired teachers with those local funds. When a pay raise is passed, that pay raise is mandated for all of those teachers, not just the teachers that are hired with state funds, but every teacher, including the ones hired with local funds. And so when you only put money in pay raises, the other communities that don't have the strong local tax base and cannot hire additional teachers with local taxes, they can't hire more teachers. They can't do anything else with those funds except pay the teachers that they have more. And they need other things too. So we do need to continue to invest in teacher salaries, certainly. But there are so many other things that need to be funded. And teachers will tell you that they want smaller classes. They want more teachers to be hired so that they can have smaller classes, more instructional materials, all the things that make their classrooms vibrant. They want that investment as well.
Are you at all concerned that the governor's opposition to this, that he'll have more support in his position in the House?
I think if the House is allowed to vote on a bill that fully funds our public schools, whether it's the Senate plan or a different plan, it certainly doesn't have to be the Senate plan. The House can come forward with a better plan. But I think if that goes before the House of Representatives, it will sail through the House just like it did the Senate. Legislators want to fully fund their schools.
You said if the House votes. Is that your concern, that the House will not vote?
That is our concern, is
Why?
that they won't get a bill in front of them. There are a few people who decide what that conference report is going to look like. So the funding bill has gone to conference. So there will be 3 members of the Senate, 3 members of the House who will decide what that bill looks like. And it can't be amended on the floor. A conference report cannot be amended on the floor. They vote up or down on what is put before them. So we are asking Mississippians to reach out to their House members to really communicate to the leadership how important it is that they get a bill in front of them that will allow them to vote to fully fund public schools.
And why do you believe the House would not put one forward to vote on? What would be the hesitation?
Well, I'm hoping that they will. That would be the only reason that we would not get full funding, is if the leadership of the House didn't allow a vote on that.
Governor Reeves wasn't the only one on social media. His likely Democratic challenger in November, Brandon Presley, wrote, quote, he said, I commend both Republicans and Democrats in the state Senate for coming together across party lines unanimously to better fund our schools. Tate Reeves has shown over and over he cares about his political career than our students. He won't lead as governor, I will. Any thoughts on?
Well, I think if Governor Reeves is concerned about his political career, he should support what 79% of Mississippians say they want, which is fully funded public schools. So I certainly think that is the better tack to take.
How do you think the subject of education will play out in the statewide elections come November?
We always encourage our folks to have conversations with all of the candidates about their positions on public education and anything that is important to them. An educated, informed electorate is always a better electorate. And in the 2019 election, what we saw was that candidates who ran on support for public schools, and many of them did, were very successful in the last election, and we hope they will be again.
You talked about where we stand in public education at the beginning here and how we've jumped from 50th to 32 and 29. Where would you like to see us going forward in the next 4, 5, 10 years, or where would you like to see Mississippi?
We absolutely want to see our national rankings improve. Again, those national tests, 4th grade reading, 4th grade math, we want to see is very well-rounded students in all areas. So we need additional investments in career and technical programs, the arts, certainly reading and math, sciences, robotics, STEM. There are all sorts of areas where parents and employers, the business community, want to see our schools continue to improve. And, I mentioned that some local communities that have a healthy tax base are able to raise their local taxes and put more into schools. What that means is that the children who are in these other communities without that local tax base are really left in the lurch. They don't have another means of making up that funding, and so we end up with have and have not school districts. And that's why, at the same time that Mississippi is really making tremendous progress in our national rankings, we still have some struggling schools because their local communities were not able to make up for what the state was failing to provide them. Every one of our children deserves that investment. Every one of our children deserves a chance. And that's why it's just so important. For me, it is a moral issue. It is so important that our state come through with their part of the bargain, their commitment, make good on that promise that they made back in 1997 to educate all of our children well. And when we do that as a state, we all benefit from that. Everyone's quality of life improves when we have strong public schools in every community. So we hope that everybody will reach out to their legislators and encourage them to do what's right, fully fund our schools.
As we're in an election cycle, just statewide and even nationally, there's been a lot of talk about school choice and that students should have a choice whether they want to go to a charter school or whatever. What is your thoughts on whether there should be public funding used to support other private and charter schools?
Well, now, charter schools are public schools. They receive the same type of funding that they receive their funding the same way that traditional public schools do. With private schools, if we're not talking about if we're talking about two separate and unequal systems where one has certain standards that they have to meet, they accept all children, they abide by regulations, and then we have another set of schools that also receive state funding that have no standards that they're held to. They don't have to tell us anything about what they're doing with that funding. They do not have to admit every child. They charge tuition beyond what the state funding would provide, and so automatically eliminate many children from being able to attend their schools. We would end up with this separate and unequal system of schools, and we've been there before, and it didn't go well. Mm-hmm. And that is why our Constitution says that no public funds shall go to a school that is not free, because when you can charge tuition, you automatically exclude a tremendous number of our children whose parents are paying taxes. So we oppose that. We think that's wrong. We agree with what our Constitution says, that public funds should be restricted to public schools.
How can we learn more about the Parents Campaign and what you guys do?
We have a website. We would encourage folks to Google the Parents Campaign and go check out our website. If they don't know who their own legislators are, they can find that out on our website. They can find out how well their schools have been funded, how much their schools are underfunded, all sorts of information on our website.
Nancy Loome with Parents Campaign, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we'll be right back. Well, some of the most high-profile legislation remains at stake as we enter the final weeks of the 2023 session. Legislation relating to the city of Jackson is among the bills heading to conference. There's Senate Bill 2343, which would expand the boundaries of the Capitol Complex Improvement District and give Capitol Police full jurisdiction within those boundaries. The House has yet to decide whether or not to agree with the Senate's changes to controversial House Bill 1020, but it is expected to go to conference. Then there's House Bill 1310. It would allow for election officials to remove an individual's name from the voting roll if that voter failed to vote in at least one local, state, or federal election over a 2-year period. The voter would be given a notice and would have to respond and participate in an election within 4 years of the notice to be kept on the voting roll. While state lawmakers continue working on legislation, the governor has already signed some bills into law. The REAP Act was signed into law in February, banning gender-affirming procedures for anyone under the age of 18 in Mississippi. Well, Governor Reeves signed a bill that would decriminalize fentanyl testing strips in the state of Mississippi, and he signed House Bill 401, which mandates electric vehicles be sold through Mississippi's franchise dealerships. Postpartum Medicaid services for new mothers have now been extended to a full year. The medical community was ecstatic after Governor Reeves put his support behind extending postpartum Medicaid care. Mississippi was one of the last states in the country to pass a year-long extension for mothers and their children. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, 60% of births in Mississippi are financed through Medicaid. We'll brief you on some fresh polling on the race for the governor's office when Mississippi Insight continues. A new poll by the Mason-Dixon and MagnoliaTribune.com gives Governor Reeves a 7-point lead against Democrat Brandon Presley. The poll of 625 likely voters found that 46% support Reeves for re-election. 39% prefer Presley for governor. A substantial 15% of respondents said they were undecided. Reeves won substantial support on the coast and in North Mississippi, while Presley carried the Delta. Metro Jackson's support edged toward Reeves, but as the pollsters note, it is still very early in the campaign, and Presley does have an opportunity to boost his name recognition as both parties spend their campaign war chest on election advertising and tours across the state. We hope to learn more about this poll from Magnolia Tribune's Russ Latino on next Sunday's program. Big thanks to Nancy Loome for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.